ABC News World Headquarters in New York. This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We're going to take a closer look tonight at a government policy in China which a great many Americans will find offensive. It is China's one-child policy, which means what it says. Our investigative unit has come upon a particularly ugly example of the policy at work. But first, a word of background. The late Mao Zedong said there could never be enough Chinese. There are 1.2 billion Chinese today. But the man who succeeded him, Deng Xiaoping, realized that too many Chinese would lower the standard of living and be an obstacle to economic development. And so in 1979, in his name, the Communist Party decreed that Chinese couples who pledged to have only one child would get financial incentives. If they had more, they would pay a penalty. But because Communist Party officials in this vast country were pressured to show results, the women, in some places, led a pretty ugly life. Here's ABC's Brian Ross.
For years, the Chinese government has denied what this Chinese official has now come forward to say, that women who defy the country's one-child-per-family policy routinely face forced sterilizations and forced abortions, including women as much as 9 months pregnant.
The child can still be alive when he comes out of his mother's womb. And as soon as the child cries, the doctor will give it another injection and the child will die.
The woman making the allegations is 37-year-old Xiaoduan Gao, who defected last month after serving 14 years as the director of a so-called planned birth center in a township of 60,000. It is a place, as seen in this videotape smuggled out of China, where Mrs. Gao says there are detailed files on the reproductive status of every woman in the township under the age of 49. A network of paid informers slips tips into this box about who has become pregnant without official authorization, according to Mrs. Gao. The tape shows what Mrs. Gao calls the sterilization doctor, with sterilization required for a variety of offenses, says Mrs. Gao, including simply missing a checkup for an IUD birth control device.
If they didn't come in for the second checkup, then we take them and we sterilize them.
And on the first floor, jail cells, a birth control jail for women who try to resist or relatives who try to hide them. Not only did Mrs. Gao bring out her videotape pictures, but with the help of Chinese dissident Harry Wu, she has smuggled out hundreds of pages of official documents.
This is unprecedented. It takes a great deal of courage to attempt that, because if you're caught doing it, the penalties can be extreme.
It turns out Mrs. Gao's defection came as she herself was in danger of being sterilized for violating China's one-child rule. She had secretly adopted an abandoned young boy, considered just as illegal as giving birth to a second child, and an informer had turned her in to Communist Party officials. Brian Ross, ABC News, New York.
It is this kind of news from China, very much out of keeping with what Americans believe in, that increases the pressure on President Clinton, who is just about to make a state visit there. A little while ago, we talked to someone who follows these developments very closely. She is Professor Susan Greenhalgh from the University of California at Irvine. Professor Greenhalgh, that's a pretty horrifying report, at least to our eyes and ears, from Brian Ross about family planning policy in China. Is it a common policy? Is what we see in that happening everywhere in China?
It's happening in many, many parts of China, but there's tremendous variation from province to province, from city, between city and countryside, and there are no figures that are maintained on how coercive the policy is countrywide. So it really is impossible to say how common such practices are. Again and again, you'll find in government rhetorics, government documents, that coercion must be avoided.
Do the Chinese in general see it in the same way that we do?
I think that the majority of the people accept the policy as something that's necessary for China at its current stage of economic development. I don't know that they see the advantages for them as individual families, but I think if you ask a large number of families in China, they will say, yes, yes, this is our policy, this is right, the state has the right to intervene and to decide how many children a couple should have. It's very difficult to find conflicting views on that issue.
Many thanks. Just one last observation about this without the slightest hint of approval. The Chinese point out that their economic miracle, they have had the fastest growing economy in the world, could not have been accomplished without population control. The United Nations estimates that China's population will grow by 24% in the next half a century. By comparison, the Indian population, more than 900 million people today, will grow by 65%. And Pakistan, 135 million people today, is expected to grow by about 162%. In this regard, family planning makes a difference.
June 9th, 1998.
The policy in China, one child per family, a policy with devastating consequences.
It is a violation of human rights when women are denied the right to plan their own families, and that includes being forced to have abortions or being sterilized against their will.
That was Hillary Clinton in 1995. Listen to a Chinese defector describe that country in 1998.
I saw some women that were 9 months pregnant put on the operating table and forced to have abortions.
It's Orwellian, it's a brave new world, and it's absolutely outrageous.
If the doctor does it correctly, the injection will be done through the mother's stomach right into the child's brain, and the child will die at that time.
And she would know. Tonight, executing orders, a crisis of conscience.
From ABC News, this is Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
It remains one of the most controversial issues here in America. It is about to become one of the most controversial aspects of this country's relationship with China. Even as President Clinton prepares to visit China at the end of this month, a congressional committee will hold hearings tomorrow on Chinese birth control policies. Even as abortion remains one of the most volatile hot-button issues on our own domestic political landscape, that bears little or no relationship to the birth control policies that are still being implemented throughout significant parts of China. In our own country, the debate often boils down to the question of whether you are pro-life, that is, opposed to all or all but a very few cases of abortion, or whether you consider yourself pro-choice. That phrase implies the belief that every woman should be entitled to make her own decision about what is happening within her own body. In this country, at least, there is no responsible or significant group recommending forced abortions. Tonight, we'll bring you eyewitness testimony that this is not true in at least one part of China. Overpopulation and an insufficiency of resources have led that country's government for more than a generation now to generate huge pressure on couples to have no more than one child. Violators of that policy have been subjected to fines and other civil penalties. But as ABC's chief investigative correspondent Brian Rossnow reports, even more draconian measures have also been employed.
By her own admission, this woman has been one of the most feared and hated people in the small town in China where she lives.
Sometimes they'd see me when they were captured, and they would curse me, or they tried to hit me with sticks.
Her name is Xiaoduan Gao, and for the last 14 years, Mrs. Gao has been the local official in the Yunga Township on the South China coast, in charge of enforcing China's one-child birth policy.
We use this card to arrest people.
With only a few exceptions, one child per family, she says, or else.
I saw some women that were 9 months pregnant put on the operating table and forced to have abortions.
Mrs. Gao is perhaps the first official at any level in China's long controversial planned birth program to reveal in startling detail what she says has become a well-organized system of forced sterilizations and abortions, including those at 9 months.
If the doctor does it correctly, the injection will be done through the mother's stomach right into the child's brain, and the child will die at that time. Or if the doctor misses a little bit, then the child can still be alive when he comes out of his mother's womb. And as soon as the child cries, the doctor will give it another injection and the child will die.
In front of the mother?
Usually. Sometimes mothers ask them, please let me have the child. And the doctors will say, oh no, can't do anything about it. And they'll just let it die.
Have you been present for such a procedure?
Yes. Sometimes I've been there. Sometimes when I've sent them up there, I've been in the room with them. I feel so sorry for them, and it feels so cruel. And if I could help them, I would.
But you're the person who signed the order, right?
Yes. I'm ordered from above.
But you signed the document?
Yes, I'm the one that executed the order. The order comes from above. I've got to carry it out.
Last month, Mrs. Gao says she finally had enough of her job and its brutal duties. Arranging for permission to take a vacation in the Philippines, she instead defected, arriving in San Francisco 3 weeks ago. Now, with the help of one of China's most active critics, Harry Wu, a former political prisoner in China, Mrs. Gao is seeking asylum in the United States, preparing to testify tomorrow before a congressional committee chaired by Congressman Christopher Smith.
Mrs. Gao is one of the most important whistleblowers in recent years to tell the truth about what's going on in the coercive population control program in China. And that's a first, where we have somebody who finally says, I've had enough. I don't want to be part of this atrocity anymore.
In the weeks before Mrs. Gao fled China, she arranged for a member of the Chinese dissident underground to come to her township to make this videotape, to provide some evidence of what she says has been going on at the planned birth center she ran out of this building. At the entrance, an informant's box for paid informers to slip information on who has become pregnant in the township. Inside, a huge records room where Mrs. Gao says there is a detailed file on every woman under the age of 49 and her reproductive status. Mrs. Gao says no one in the township of 60,000 was authorized to become pregnant unless she said so.
This is the permit to have children. After people are married, they apply to have permission to have the children. And if they get pregnant without permission, then we have to force them to have an abortion. And if they're not willing to, if they run away or we capture their parents or something else, we force them to do it.
On the first floor, jail cells, a birth control jail for women who, Mrs. Gao says, refuse to be sterilized or who become pregnant without her approval. Relatives who help to hide such women also end up here, she says.
The people that are captured are locked up in there. There's one for locking up men and one for locking up women.
And how long will people be locked up?
Oh, sometimes they're locked up for 5 or 6 months. Some have even been locked up for 8 months.
Mrs. Gao secretly took these pictures on another day when, she says, several women were actually in custody, including some who were to be sterilized for failing to have their birth control IUDs checked on schedule.
Every 3 months, they have to come in for a checkup. And if they didn't come in for the second checkup, then we take them and we sterilize them.
And you keep them in jail until they finally agree to go through with being sterilized?
Right.
The tape shows what Mrs. Gao calls the sterilization doctor and the abortion room for abortions in the first trimester. Abortions for women in the final months of their pregnancy, up to and including 9 months, are done at a hospital because of the serious nature of that procedure.
It doesn't matter how old the child is. If it is outside the family planning, then it has to be aborted.
And how many times did this happen over the course of the 14 years you ran the planned birth center?
Hundreds of times.
There are people, many people, who would call an abortion at 9 months. They would use the term murder, not abortion.
But there's nothing we could do.
Mrs. Gao is not only willing to blow the whistle on China's policies, but also to share her own family secret. Part 2 of Brian Ross's report in a moment.
This is ABC News Nightline.
Ever since a high-profile speech in Beijing 3 years ago by Hillary Rodham Clinton, the Chinese government has been put on notice about forced sterilizations and abortions.
It is a violation of human rights when women are denied the right to plan their own families, and that includes being forced to have abortions or being sterilized against their will.
But the hundreds of pages of documents smuggled out of China by Mrs. Gao from her planned birth center indicate that, at least in her province, the warnings by Mrs. Clinton and others have been widely ignored. The documents, according to an expert who has seen them, provide a first detailed picture of just how extreme the Chinese government can be in enforcing its one-child policy.
I don't think we have ever seen a collection of documents at that level specifying the exact tactics to be used in enforcement of the family planning program.
John Aird is the former chief of the China branch at the U.S. Census Bureau and a critic of Chinese birth control tactics.
It is a very grim picture, and this at a time when the United States and other countries are easing up in their demands on inspection of human rights in China.
Of course, not all abortions and sterilizations are forced, but the documents show specific instructions on how to use sterilization as punishment for uncooperative women and men, guidelines for setting up a network of paid informers, and much more.
This represents coercion on a scale beyond anything that the world has ever seen. And it also represents a massive assault on women in China, because women bear the brunt of all of these measures.
Mrs. Gao says in the last few years, she has been secretly trying to help some of the women who she has put through hell, including this young woman who was unmarried, 19 years old, and 9 months pregnant with an unauthorized child when an informer turned her in and a squad of men was sent to the family home.
The work group went over there and told her to come out, and she was not willing to. She was hiding inside of her mother's house. They were threatening to demolish the house.
According to Mrs. Gao, her men then smashed and nearly destroyed the house, seen in this photo. What Mrs. Gao says is a common practice when someone refuses to cooperate with the birth control forces.
She was about to have the baby. She wasn't willing to come out.
She was screaming, or?
Oh, yeah. She was crying. She was crying.
And then she was forcibly taken to have an abortion?
Yes, they took her over to have the abortion, and she gave birth to a baby boy, and the mother just cried and cried.
And what happened to the boy, the little baby?
There's nothing they could do. He came out and he died.
According to Mrs. Gao, the woman's child had been injected in the head with some kind of solution and died shortly after being born. Do you regret what you did?
Of course. Many times when I went back home, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep well.
Did you feel guilty?
I guess that's why I came here.
Through all of this, Mrs. Gao has had her own family secret, a young boy she adopted after he was abandoned. As Mrs. Gao knew better than anyone, it was illegal for her to do so because she and her husband already had one child, a daughter. Such adoptions are considered the same as actually giving birth to a second child.
When co-workers come to my house, I have to hide that child. And sometimes I tell the child, in the open, you can't call me mommy.
So you were breaking the very law that you were in charge of enforcing by having this second child?
Yes, so you could consider me as illegal. I hid the child at my mother's house, but then someone reported that there was a child at my mother's house, and so there was an order for an investigation that came down for me. And so I hid the child at my friend's house.
Even though you were in charge of the so-called planned birth center?
It's the same thing. We have a one-child policy for everybody, and if they found I had two, then I'd be fired and I'd be fined.
In fact, Mrs. Gao says if she had been caught, she too would have been sent to the same sterilization room to which she had sent so many others. Brian Ross, ABC News, New York.
The Chinese embassy here in Washington declined our invitation to respond to the charges that will be amplified before Congress tomorrow. Is it possible to get a handle on China's population growth without forced birth control? Two views when we come back. Former Congressman Peter Kostmeyer is executive director of the grassroots group Zero Population Growth. He is with us here in our Washington bureau. And joining us from Irvine, California, Professor Susan Greenhalgh, a China population specialist who also teaches anthropology and women's studies at the University of California. Let's see if we can get some kind of a baseline. Professor, any reason to disbelieve what you have just heard?
I think it's quite possible that these sorts of practices are evident in Fujian province, which is where Ms. Gao came from. Fujian has been known for being a place where the policy has been enforced with special vigor.
Are you saying that, to the best of your knowledge, policies such as these are not carried out in other parts of China?
No, there's tremendous amount of variation from province to province, between urban and rural areas, even from township to township and village to village. It's truly impossible to say how representative the situation that she describes is of the country as a whole.
Mr. Kostmeyer, as committed as you are to the notion of zero population growth, I'm sure you don't approve of any of the methodologies that we've heard described here, but let me ask you to put it in your own words.
No, these are reprehensible violations of the most basic and fundamental human rights. I think we probably should believe the worst about what we hear about China. It's a repressive regime. It's a very closed society. I think we have to believe that these things are happening and probably take a very pessimistic view of what's happening in China.
And as best you can determine, how widespread is it?
I don't know how widespread, but if it happens once, that's a fundamental violation of human rights. It only has to happen to one woman in one province, one time, for this country to be outraged.
Professor Greenhalgh, I'd like you to give a little bit of context, at least, for why, and obviously these policies, as I said before, are so draconian. I don't think there is any kind of approval that can be given of those. But why is it necessary, in the view of the Chinese government, to have any sort of a policy that dictates to families how many children they may or may not have?
Well, you have to look at what was happening in China in the late 1970s. The one-child policy was introduced in 1979. That was round about the time that Mao Zedong died, Zhou Enlai died in 1976. And a new regime came to power. This regime wanted to set aside the old communist ideology and to base its legitimacy on rapid economic development.
Congressman Kostmeyer, when we observed policies like this during the Nazi regime in Germany and following the Second World War, the United States helped prosecute these kinds of things as war crimes. This is really no different, is it?
I don't think it's fundamentally different. I don't know that we can engage in prosecution in a sovereign country, but I think the president needs to take a strong position when he visits China, as he will be very shortly, and speak out against this. I think what's happening here is something different, though, and that is that Congressman Smith and others in China, others in Congress, are using what's happening in China as a way of stopping all family planning, which we contribute to around the world. And the U.S. doesn't contribute anything to the Chinese program, either directly or indirectly through the UN. But Congressman Smith and others want to stop all family planning around the world. He's been a consistent foe of international family planning. He also wants to stop it in the United States, and he's using China as an excuse. So there's no question that what's happening in China is reprehensible, but we mustn't lose sight of the good work that voluntary family planning has done all over the world and in our own country.
I'll tell you what,
I'd like to jump in here.
Well, go ahead and jump in, please.
Yes, I think that this whole discussion is very troubling, especially when you talk about Nazism. I personally am very troubled with the representations of China's birth control program that we get here in the U.S. media. I think the situation in China is much more complex than this kind of discussion indicates. What's happening is that China is a socialist country. The state is supposed to plan both economic development the production of economic goods as well as the production of people, in other words, reproduction. And from the early 1970s, there have been specific numerical targets that the population policy has been driven by. And in my view, this is the problem, because there's no scientific basis for the specific targets that have guided the policy.
Let's just take a short break, and we'll be back with time for one more question and answer to each of you in just a moment. And we're back once again with Peter Kostmeyer and Susan Greenhall. How, at one and the same time, can China be encouraged to engage in keeping its population growth under control and at the same time discouraged from participating in the kinds of procedures that we've heard enunciated on this program today? Professor Greenhall?
I think it's important to recognize that a lot of things are happening in China today in the policy. On the one hand, people want fewer children, so there's less need for pressure. On the other hand, the State Birth Planning Commission is trying to Cairoize the policy, that is to push it in the direction of women's empowerment. Now, I personally am very skeptical that they're going to get very far, because the one-child policy is still formulated in written regulations, written laws of the provinces of the PRC, and I think that we have to change the laws before the program can really be modified.
Well, obviously, forgive me, but we're running out of time, and obviously we are not in any position to change Chinese laws. So, Mr. Kostmeyer, what do you think can be done?
I think you're right. We're not going to change what's happening in China, but we need to influence policy. Two things have to happen worldwide. One is the U.S. has to devote more of its resources to international family planning. It's working. Fertility rates are dropping all over the world. And secondly, as educational and economic opportunities for women move up, fertility drops. So if we empower women with more education, with more economic opportunity, fertility rates come down. You join that with voluntary family planning, we can solve the population problem. The world's population is going by about 168 a minute. The world's population, which is 5.9 billion, could double in 50 years. It's the #1 problem on the planet. We need to solve it, but we need to solve it voluntarily and through the empowerment of women.
And on that note, let me thank you both. Mr. Kostmeyer, Professor Greenhall, good of you to join us. And that's our report for tonight.
This is CNN.
A big verdict against Big Tobacco found liable for a death in Florida, as promise of a tax cut breathes new life into the tobacco bill in Washington. A victory for school choice crusaders in Wisconsin. Critics say it violates the separation of church and state. Southern Baptists put their faith in husbands telling wives to graciously submit. And a new clue to the mystery of sudden infant death syndrome. I'm Jim Moray, tonight at CNN Center.
Good evening, I'm Joey Chen. This is The World Today.
Nighttime raids and forced abortions. Coming up, one woman's story of human rights violations in China.
In the world now, 2 weeks from now, President Clinton will set off for China on the first visit by a U.S. leader since the 1989 crackdown on pro-democracy activists there. Already, though, the trip is drawing criticism from the left and from the right. And Mr. Clinton is moving to answer both sides. From the White House, CNN senior correspondent Wolf Blitzer.
Under pressure for allegedly pandering to the Chinese government, President Clinton is going on the offensive. On Thursday, he'll deliver a major speech defending his policy at his state visit to China later this month.
I expect the president will directly answer those critics that suggest that it would be better at this point in human history to isolate the billions of people who live in China and treat that nation as a rogue nation.
But Mr. Clinton may have a hard sell. On Wednesday, a House subcommittee heard testimony and saw graphic videotape alleging that China continues a brutal policy of forced abortions.
Once I found a woman who was 9 months pregnant but did not have a birth allowed certificate. According to the policy, she was forced to undergo an induced abortion. In the operating room, I saw the child's lips were moving and how its arms and legs were also moving. The doctor injected poison into its skull, and the child died. and it was thrown into the trash can.
The Chinese government denies it encourages such abortions, but the White House does not dispute the allegations. It insists the best way to deal with this and other problems is to engage the Chinese government directly. Critics say Mr. Clinton's policy is wrong.
It has been a policy that has subjugated human rights to trade and has subjugated national security to trade interests and profits.
Mr. Clinton will be the first U.S. president to visit China since the government crackdown at Tiananmen Square in 1989. A coalition of human rights activists, including conservative Gary Bauer and liberal Kerry Kennedy Cuomo, has written to him asking that at a minimum he stay away from Tiananmen.
It's almost 9 years to the day since the Chinese government slaughtered hundreds, perhaps thousands of innocent student demonstrators there. They've expressed no remorse for that.
In his speech, the president will also defend his controversial decision to authorize U.S. satellite launchings on Chinese missiles. That, too, may be a tough sell. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, the White House.
As Wolf mentioned, China's one-child policy is fueling congressional debate over President Clinton's China trip. The focal point, allegations of forced abortion. More now from CNN's Jonathan Karl.
Video smuggled from China's Fujian province tells a disturbing story. Suspected of illegally having a baby and hiding it, this woman claims the government forced her to be sterilized, prompting her husband to beat her and leave her, saying, "What good is a chicken who cannot lay an egg?" The tape was presented as part of an emotional hearing on China's family planning policies. The lead witness was a woman who worked as an official in a Chinese family planning clinic.
All of those 14 years, I was a monster in the daytime, injuring others by the Chinese Communist authorities' barbaric planned birth policy.
With the help of human rights activist and China critic Harry Wu, who also testified, the woman fled China earlier this year. Smuggling documents, she says, proves China uses forced abortion and sterilization to carry out a policy of limiting families to one child. There is no independent verification of her story.
Whenever I saw these things, my heart would break, and I felt like to help a tyrant do evils was not what I wanted.
A spokesman for the Chinese embassy tells CNN that his government uses only, quote, education and persuasion to carry out its family planning policy, and frequently allows families to have a second child. He denied a policy of forced abortion and said the government will examine evidence presented at the hearing. This hearing is the latest in a series of efforts to put pressure on President Clinton in advance of his trip to China later this month.
The blood of the people at the Tiananmen Square is still stained on the ground. Okay. If you went over there as a guest of the communist butcher, if you stand together with them into the Tiananmen Square with them, and now you are in the wrong side of the history.
These latest allegations won't keep President Clinton from visiting China. Instead, the White House says it will raise human rights issues, including concerns about the family planning policy in meetings with the Chinese government. Jonathan Karl, CNN, Washington.
President Clinton will spell out his China policy tomorrow in a speech before the National Geographic Society. CNN will carry that live at 11 a.m. Eastern. Back in a moment.